The Dream Hourglass. Chapter 1: The Silent Clock Shop. At the edge of an old town, where the cobblestone streets grew narrower, stood a small and unassuming clock shop. It was called the Weaver of Time, marked only by a modest wooden sign swaying above the entrance. There were no advertisements, no flashy displays, just an inviting, quiet glow from within. Eric, the protagonist, discovered the shop entirely by chance. That day, Eric had been walking home, fuming over a disagreement at work. Distracted by his thoughts, he had taken a wrong turn and found himself in an unfamiliar alley. It was there that he noticed the soft light spilling out from the clock shop. In the dim, shadowed street, the warm glow seemed oddly welcoming. A shop like this? Here? Eric muttered to himself. Curious, he pushed open the wooden door. The shop was filled with old-fashioned clocks of every size and design, their steady ticking overlapping in a strangely harmonious rhythm. Wall-mounted pendulum clocks swayed back and forth, while delicate mantel clocks ticked softly atop shelves. The layered sounds blended into a soothing melody that instantly quieted Eric's restless mind. Welcome, a calm voice called from the back of the shop. Eric turned to see an elderly man standing behind a counter. The man was small and slightly hunched, wearing a work apron that had seen many years of use. His eyes glimmered with a mysterious wisdom, as though he had witnessed the passage of countless years. Has this shop always been here? Eric asked casually, trying to mask his curiosity. The shopkeeper didn't answer right away. Instead, he offered a faint smile. Is there something you're looking for? Not really, Eric replied, glancing around. I just wanted to look around. Eric began walking through the shop, drawn to the intricate craftsmanship of the clocks. Each piece seemed meticulously maintained, with details that spoke of both skill and care. Among the many clocks, his eyes were drawn to a small hourglass sitting on a shelf. It was no taller than his hand, its glass so clear it seemed invisible, and its frame adorned with delicate, intricate carvings. Inside, the silver sand flowed slowly, catching the light like tiny stars. What about this? Eric asked, pointing to the hourglass. The shopkeeper stepped closer, his footsteps barely audible. That, he said softly, is a dream hourglass. A dream hourglass? Eric repeated, intrigued. Yes, the shopkeeper said, his voice low and steady. Place it by your bed before you sleep, and it will guide you into extraordinary dreams. But... The shopkeeper paused, his words hanging in the air. The dreams it brings forth are not ordinary. They reveal truths hidden deep within your heart. If you're ready to face them, I'll entrust it to you. Eric frowned slightly, half believing the old man's words. Yet, there was something about the hourglass, its silvery glow, the quiet rhythm of the sand, that captivated him. How much is it? He asked. There is no price, the shopkeeper replied. If I believe you're the right person to use it, I'll give it to you. Eric hesitated briefly before nodding. The shopkeeper wrapped the hourglass carefully and handed it over. Eric thanked him and stepped out into the cool evening air, the hourglass secure in his bag. That night, Eric placed the hourglass on his nightstand. Its silvery sand trickled down silently, its rhythm almost hypnotic. As he lay in bed, the gentle sound lulled him to sleep, like a lullaby whispered just for him. When Eric opened his eyes, he found himself standing in a forest bathed in pale moonlight. The trees shimmered faintly, as though woven from strands of light. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint ticking of a clock. The air was still, yet alive with an eerie energy. From the shadows of the forest, he felt something, or someone, begin to approach. Chapter 2: The Forest of Time. A cold breeze brushed against Eric's cheek as he stood frozen in the unfamiliar forest. Confusion clouded his mind. Just moments ago, he had been in his bed, staring at the soft glow of the dream hourglass. Now, he found himself surrounded by towering trees bathed in an ethereal, silvery light. The faint ticking of a clock echoed through the stillness. "Is this a dream?" he murmured to himself. Eric pinched his cheek, but there was no pain. Everything around him felt too vivid to dismiss as mere imagination. The crisp scent of the forest, the soft crunch of leaves beneath his feet, the subtle hum of the wind, it all felt startlingly real. From somewhere deeper in the woods, he heard a faint sound, tick-tock, tick-tock. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, drawing his attention. As he turned toward the sound, he noticed a dim light flickering between the trees. It shimmered like starlight, its silver glow reminiscent of the sand in the hourglass. "Well, I guess there's only one way to find out," Eric muttered, his curiosity pushing him forward. The soft forest floor muffled his footsteps as he cautiously approached the light. The air seemed to hum with energy, growing heavier with each step. Finally, he emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood an enormous clock, unlike anything Eric had ever seen. Its face was as tall as he was, and its metallic frame was intricately engraved with swirling patterns. Instead of hands, the center of the clock housed a large hourglass. The silver sand inside flowed upward, defying gravity. "What is this?" Eric whispered, stepping closer. Before he could touch the clock, a faint rustling came from behind him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. There, half hidden among the shadows of the trees, stood a figure. It was indistinct, cloaked in darkness, its outline shimmering faintly like the light of the moon. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice shaking slightly. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Though its face was obscured, Eric felt its gaze fixed on him. It raised an arm and pointed silently toward the clock. Eric turned back to the massive clock. The sand in the hourglass had begun to flow faster, and the ticking sound grew louder, echoing around the clearing. "What's happening?" he muttered, his pulse quickening. The figure stepped closer, its presence pressing against Eric like a weight. Then, without warning, the hourglass inside the clock shattered. Silver sand spilled into the air, swirling like a storm, and Eric felt himself being pulled toward the clock's face. The world around him dissolved into light and sound, spinning wildly as he was dragged into the heart of the clock. Inside the clock. When Eric opened his eyes, he found himself in a strange, otherworldly landscape. He stood in the middle of a vast, barren plain, where the ground was made of gleaming metal and enormous gears turned slowly in the distance. Above him, the sky was filled with floating hourglasses, each one glowing faintly as sand trickled inside them. "Where am I?" Eric said, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "This is the threshold of time," a familiar voice answered. Eric whirled around to find the shadowy figure standing behind him. This time, its outline was clearer, its form almost human but still wreathed in an ethereal glow. "You again," Eric said, his voice sharp. "What's going on? Why am I here?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. "You are here because you chose to be," it said calmly. "The hourglass you carry connects you to this place, a realm where your deepest truths reside." "My deepest truths," Eric repeated. "What does that even mean?" The figure gestured toward the sky. "Each hourglass represents a piece of memory, a fragment of time you have forgotten or hidden. One of them belongs to you." Eric followed the figure's gaze and saw a single hourglass glowing brighter than the rest. Its light pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing his attention. His chest tightened as a wave of inexplicable familiarity washed over him. "That's mine?" he asked. The figure nodded. "But retrieving it will not be easy. To claim it, you must face the shadow of your own past." Eric's fists clenched. "And what if I don't?" "Then the truth will remain lost," the figure said simply. "Your dreams will grow darker, and your waking life emptier. The choice is yours." Eric hesitated, but the glowing hourglass seemed to call out to him, pulling him forward. Whatever lay inside, he had to know. He took a deep breath and started toward it. The pulse of memory. As Eric approached the hourglass, the landscape around him began to shift. The metallic plane softened, and faint images flickered in the air. He saw glimpses of places he couldn't quite recognize: house, a garden, a woman's silhouette. Each fragment tugged at his heart, stirring emotions he couldn't name. When he reached the hourglass, it floated down to meet him. Up close, its light was almost blinding. Eric reached out and placed his hands on the glass. The moment he touched it, the sand inside began to flow rapidly, and the world around him dissolved once more. Eric awoke in his bed with a start. His breath was heavy, his body drenched in sweat. The dream hourglass sat on his nightstand, its silver sand nearly gone. He stared at it, the images from his dream flashing through his mind. "What was that?" he whispered. "What am I supposed to remember?" Eric didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain: the hourglass held the key to something he had long forgotten. And he wasn't about to stop until he uncovered the truth. Chapter 3: The Sands of Memory. Eric sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the now empty dream hourglass. The room was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. The dream, the forest, the figure, the glowing hourglass, lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Who was she? He murmured to himself. And what does this all mean? The faint silver glow of the hourglass seemed to pulse in response, as if urging him onward. He reached out to touch it, and the glass felt warm beneath his fingertips. A strange sensation coursed through him, not unpleasant but unsettling, like the hourglass was inviting him to return. I don't have a choice, do I? Eric muttered, his resolve hardening. If this is the only way to find answers, then so be it. He placed the hourglass back on his nightstand, lay down, and closed his eyes. The faint ticking of unseen clocks echoed in his ears as his consciousness slipped into darkness. The forest of shifting time. When Eric opened his eyes, he was back in the dream, but this time the landscape had changed. He was standing in a vast meadow under a sky filled with floating hourglasses. Each one shimmered with a soft light, casting a faint glow on the field below. In the distance, enormous gears turned slowly, their steady rhythm blending with the ticking sound that seemed to come from everywhere. Eric felt a pull, an invisible thread tugging him toward a specific point in the meadow. As he followed the pull, he saw the shadowy figure from before. It stood still, its outline clearer now, almost human but still radiating an otherworldly glow. You again, Eric said, stopping a few paces away. You know what's going on, don't you? The figure nodded but said nothing. Who are you? Eric demanded. Why am I here? Instead of answering, the figure raised its arm and pointed toward the horizon. There, a single hourglass floated brighter than the rest, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. That hourglass belongs to you, the figure finally said, its voice calm and steady. It holds a piece of your memory, a part of yourself you've lost. Eric stared at the glowing hourglass, a strange mix of fear and determination welling up inside him. What memory? What did I forget? The figure stepped closer, its presence heavy but not threatening. Not all memories are easy to reclaim. Some are buried for a reason. To reach it, you must face what you have hidden from yourself. Eric felt his pulse quicken. And if I don't? Then the hourglass will remain here, and the truth will stay buried, the figure replied. But the void inside you will grow, and the questions will never stop haunting you. Eric clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the glowing hourglass in the distance. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Whatever this was, it was too important. All right, he said, taking a deep breath. Show me. The hourglass of truth. As Eric approached the glowing hourglass, the air around him grew heavy, as though the meadow itself were alive. The closer he got, the more his surroundings began to change. Shadows flickered and swirled, forming shapes and images in the air, fleeting glimpses of places and people he couldn't quite place. Finally, he reached the hourglass. Up close, its glow was almost blinding, and the sand inside sparkled like stardust. Eric hesitated, his hand hovering over the glass. The figure's words echoed in his mind, To reach it, you must face what you have hidden. Swallowing his fear, he touched the hourglass. Instantly, the sand inside began to swirl, and the world around him dissolved into light. The hidden memory. Eric found himself standing in a familiar yet distant place, a small backyard bathed in warm sunlight. Flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the faint laughter of a child echoed nearby. He realized with a start that this was his childhood home. "This is my house," he whispered. The sound of laughter grew louder, and Eric turned to see a young boy, himself as a child, running through the garden. Beside him was a woman with a kind, gentle smile. Her face stirred something deep in Eric's chest, a strange mix of warmth and sorrow. "Who is she?" he asked aloud. The woman knelt beside the boy, handing him a small wooden box. Her lips moved, and though Eric couldn't hear her words clearly, he felt the weight of their importance. The scene shifted, the edges blurring like a dream unraveling. Eric tried to move closer, but his feet wouldn't obey. The woman's figure began to fade, and her voice echoed faintly in his ears. "Remember the promise, Eric. This hourglass will guide you when the time comes." Eric's chest tightened as the memory faded entirely, leaving him alone in a vast emptiness. Awakening. Eric jolted awake, gasping for air. He sat up, his heart pounding as the images from the dream replayed in his mind. The woman, the boy, the wooden box, it all felt so real, yet he still couldn't piece it together. Turning to the dream hourglass on his nightstand, he noticed something different. Though the sand had been completely gone before, now a single grain of silver sand lay at the bottom, faintly glowing. "Who was she?" Eric whispered, his voice trembling. "What promise did I make?" The hourglass offered no answers, its glow fading into stillness. But Eric knew this was far from over. The memories were returning, and with them, the truth he had long buried. Chapter 4: Another Promise. The dream hourglass sat on Eric's nightstand, its faint glow pulsing softly in the dim light of his room. He stared at it, a sense of urgency growing in his chest. The dream, the woman, the promise, none of it made sense, and yet, it all felt undeniably real. "Who is she?" Eric murmured, his voice barely audible. "And what did I promise?" As if in response, the hourglass shimmered faintly, its glow almost inviting him to continue the journey. Eric reached out, his fingers brushing the cool glass. A strange warmth spread through his hand, and a familiar pull gripped his consciousness. "All right," Eric said, exhaling deeply. "Let's finish this." He lay back down on the bed, clutching the hourglass in his hands. Its gentle ticking grew louder, blending into the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Slowly, the world around him faded, and he slipped into the dream once more. The clockwork maze. Eric found himself standing in a vast, mechanical labyrinth. The floor beneath him was made of interlocking gears, slowly turning with a low, grinding hum. Massive cogs and wheels towered on all sides, their movements synchronized in a hypnotic rhythm. Above him, the sky was filled with floating hourglasses, their silver light casting shifting patterns across the maze. "Where am I now?" Eric muttered, turning in circles as he took in his surroundings. "This is the memory corridor," a familiar voice answered. Eric spun around to find the shadowy figure standing behind him. This time, the figure's form was clearer, more human-like, though it still radiated an ethereal glow. "You again," Eric said. "What is this place?" The figure gestured to the maze around them. "This is where your forgotten memories reside, protected by the barriers your mind has created." Eric's eyes narrowed. "Barriers? What are you talking about?" "Not all memories are easy to reclaim," the figure said. "Some are hidden to protect you from pain. To reach the truth, you must pass through the maze and face what you've been avoiding." Eric felt a flicker of hesitation, but he shook it off. "I'm ready. Lead the way." The figure nodded and pointed to a glowing hourglass in the distance. Unlike the others, this one pulsed with a steady light, its glow almost alive. "That hourglass contains your forgotten promise," the figure said. "But the path to it will not be easy. There is a shadow waiting for you, one that reflects the parts of yourself you've tried to hide." Eric clenched his fists, steeling himself. "Then I'll face it. I'm not backing down." The shadow within. As Eric moved through the maze, the air grew heavier. The grinding of the gears echoed louder, and the silver light of the hourglasses above flickered erratically. Soon, he reached a wide clearing where the glowing hourglass hovered in the center. Its light pulsed softly, as though beckoning him closer. Just as he stepped forward, the shadows around him began to shift. Slowly, a figure emerged, a dark silhouette that mirrored his own shape. Its edges shimmered like smoke, and its eyes glowed faintly with a pale light. "You're the shadow?" Eric asked, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. The figure said nothing. Instead, it raised an arm and pointed at Eric. In an instant, the maze seemed to come alive. The gears began to spin faster, the air crackling with energy. The ground trembled beneath Eric's feet. Eric staggered but stood his ground. "You're not stopping me," he said firmly. The shadow moved forward, its presence heavy and oppressive. As it drew closer, Eric felt a strange pull in his chest, an overwhelming sense of familiarity. It wasn't just a threat, it was a part of him. "You're me," Eric whispered. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. "You're the part of me I've been ignoring, the pain I didn't want to face." The shadow stopped, its form flickering as though it was waiting for him to continue. Eric's voice softened. "I get it now. I've been running from the truth, from the things I didn't want to remember. But I'm done running." He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the shadow. As he reached out, the figure dissolved into a swirl of light and shadow, merging into his chest. A wave of warmth washed over him, and the maze grew silent. The forgotten promise. With the shadow gone, the glowing hourglass descended gently into Eric's hands. He held it carefully, feeling the weight of it, the soft hum of its energy. As he touched the glass, images began to flood his mind. He saw himself as a child, laughing in a sunlit garden. Beside him was the woman from his dreams, her kind smile filled with warmth. She knelt down and handed him a small wooden box. "Eric," her voice echoed faintly, "remember our promise. When the time comes, this hourglass will guide you back to me." The memory shifted. The woman's face grew blurred, her figure fading into light. The child, his younger self, cried out for her as she disappeared, clutching the hourglass tightly. Awakening. Eric woke with a jolt, his breath coming in short gasps. He sat up, clutching his chest as the fragments of the dream pieced themselves together. The woman, the promise, the shadow, all of it was starting to make sense. Turning to the dream hourglass on his nightstand, he saw that a faint glow had returned to the glass. A single grain of silver sand lay at the bottom, pulsing gently. "She gave this to me," Eric whispered. "She wanted me to remember." But why? The hourglass offered no answers, its light dimming once more. But Eric knew his journey wasn't over. Somewhere in the fragments of his memory lay the truth, and he was closer than ever to uncovering it. Chapter 5: The Door to Truth. The faint silver glow of the dream hourglass pulsed steadily, illuminating Eric's bedroom in the quiet of the night. His fingers brushed the glass, tracing its smooth surface as if trying to draw out the answers it held. The fragments of memory from his dream lingered vividly in his mind: the woman, the promise, and the shadow he had faced. "Who is she?" Eric whispered, his voice heavy with both confusion and resolve. "And why does this feel so important?" The hourglass responded with a soft hum, its single grain of silver sand glowing brighter. Eric knew it was calling him back. Whatever the truth was, it lay in the world of dreams, waiting for him to uncover it. "I can't stop now," he murmured. He lay back on the bed, clutching the hourglass to his chest. The ticking sound grew louder, merging with the rhythm of his breathing as his consciousness slipped away once more. The house of memory. When Eric opened his eyes, he found himself standing in a garden bathed in warm sunlight. The air smelled of blooming flowers, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. It was the same garden he had seen in his dreams before, his childhood home. "This place again," he muttered, looking around. The house stood nearby, exactly as he remembered it from years ago. A wave of nostalgia and unease washed over him. Something important had happened here, but his mind couldn't fully grasp what. As Eric walked toward the house, a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, near a large oak tree in the corner of the garden, stood a woman. She was the same one he had seen in his dreams, her white dress flowing gently in the breeze, her smile as warm as the sunlight. "Eric," she called softly, her voice like a melody. "You came back. Who are you?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. "Why do I keep seeing you?" The woman's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of quiet sorrow. "Do you not remember me? We made a promise, you and I." "A promise?" Eric's chest tightened as fragments of memory stirred within him. I think I remember, but it's blurry. The woman nodded, as if expecting this. She pointed to the base of the oak tree. Do you see that box? Open it. It holds what you've been searching for. Unveiling the past. Eric walked toward the oak tree, his steps hesitant but determined. Beneath the tree's sprawling roots, half buried in the soil, was a small wooden box. Its surface was worn, but the carvings on its lid were unmistakable, swirling patterns identical to those on the dream hourglass. His hands trembled as he lifted the box and opened it. Inside, he found a photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed a much younger Eric, sitting on a bench in the garden. Beside him was the woman, her arm wrapped gently around his shoulders. They were both smiling, their expressions filled with warmth. Eric's fingers traced the edges of the photograph as a wave of emotion surged through him. You were part of my life. But why don't I remember you? He unfolded the paper, his heart pounding as he read the words written in delicate handwriting. Dear Eric, if you are reading this, then you have found your way back to the truth. When you were a child, we spent only a brief time together, but those days were precious to me. I wanted so badly to stay by your side, but life had other plans. Before I left, I gave you the dream hourglass, knowing it would guide you back to this moment someday. You might have forgotten me, but I never forgot you. This hourglass isn't just a tool to recover memories, it's a gift to help you heal. Your journey isn't over yet, but I hope remembering me will help you move forward. With love, Anna. Anna. Eric whispered, the name unlocking something deep within him. He remembered flashes of her now, her laughter, her kindness, the way she had comforted him when he felt alone. She had been more than just a relative or caretaker. She had been a part of his heart, a guiding light during his childhood. Tears welled in his eyes as he clutched the letter to his chest. I didn't forget you because I wanted to, he said, his voice breaking. I just didn't know how to hold on. A new beginning. As Eric stood beneath the oak tree, the garden around him began to shift. The sunlight grew warmer, the flowers blooming more vibrantly. The woman, Anna, approached him, her form radiant and glowing. You found what you needed, she said gently. But your journey isn't over. The hourglass is still with you because there's more to discover. Eric nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. I understand now. Thank you, Anna, for everything. She smiled, her figure beginning to fade into the light. I'll always be with you, Eric. Don't ever forget that. With those words, she disappeared, leaving Eric alone in the garden. But this time, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loss. Instead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Awakening. Eric woke up with tears streaming down his face. The dream hourglass sat on his nightstand, glowing faintly. He reached out and picked it up, holding it close. Anna, he whispered. I'll carry your memory with me. I promise. The single grain of sand inside the hourglass shone brighter for a moment, as if in acknowledgement, before settling into a soft glow. Eric knew there was still more to uncover, more truths hidden within the sands of time. But for now, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead.